Do you want to become a real estate photographer? Check out rigmcavoyphotography.com/courses, where you will find my course cunningly titled How to Become a Real Estate Photographer, How Utterly Splendid. And for August only, there is a whopping 25% off the price using the code PODCASTAUGUST. Even more utterly splendid. Enjoy the podcast. Camera Lenses Explained, my beginner's guide. Part 1. Hi, and a very warm welcome to episode 189, no less, of the Photography Explained podcast. I'm your host Rick, and in each episode, I will try to explain one photographic thing to you in plain English in less than 27 minutes-ish without the irrelevant details. I'm a professionally qualified photographer based in England with a lifetime of photographic experience, which I share with you in my podcast. Right then, here is the answery bit. Camera lenses attach to the front of camera bodies and focus what you're taking a photo of onto the camera sensor, or film. You can get lenses with different focal lengths, apertures, and varying sizes, weights, and indeed quality. And I'm going to explain all these in this episode and tell you what lenses I use. Yes, how exciting. Oh yeah, you can get cameras with lenses physically attached to the camera, but I'm not talking about those. Although, most of what I talk about here will apply anyway. This is a listener question from Karen in Gloucester, Virginia. Karen texted me this. Hello, Rick. I'm a hobby photographer and learning quite a lot from your podcast. Thank you for that. Thank you, Karen. Can you do an episode strictly on lenses, explain in detail what the numbers mean, what is best for what situation, etc.? It can be confusing for a rookie. Thank you, Karen. P.S. If you've already done an episode like this, would you mind sharing the number? I haven't been able to find one. Cheers. Well, I have done some episodes on lenses before, but I thought it was time to do a new episode, and here it is. Karen, thank you very much for getting in touch. I'm delighted to finally answer your question. And you, dear listener, you can send a text as well, just like Karen did by hitting the send as a text thing on the top of the episode notes. So thanks again for getting in touch, Karen. Now let me crack on with answering your question. So that was the answer bit, and here is the talky bit. Easy for you to say, Rick. Well, first off, why not have a built-in lens? Well, you can get cameras with built-in lenses. These days they tend to be called phones, don't they though? Just saying. No, cameras that can take different lenses, they give you more options. It's that simple. And you can choose the lens or lenses that work for you. Now, quick stupid photography term. Interchangeable lens cameras have the acronym ILC. Although I've never used this acronym other than to tell you what this means, so we can forget that and move on. That's another stupid photography term. Here I'm talking about mirrorless cameras and DSLR cameras, okay? But a lot of the principles will apply whatever camera you're using. So let's start at the beginning. What does the lens on a camera do? In very simplistic terms, the lens focuses the light onto the camera image sensor. Oh yeah, and it also allows you to see what you're taking a photo of. Well, that's if you're using a DSLR camera, that is. See, with a DSLR camera, you're actually looking through the lens when you're composing and taking a photo. With a mirrorless camera, you're not, because there's no mirror. Well, you'd hope there wasn't a mirror, wouldn't you, with that name? No, with a mirrorless camera, you're looking through an electronic viewfinder, also known as an EVF, which shows an electronic interpretation of what your lens is capturing. Right then, so what about those numbers on lenses? Yep, there are numbers on lenses such as focal length and aperture. So Karen, we'll start with these as you asked specifically about them. Focal length, what does that mean? The focal length of a lens determines the angle of view. Focal length is the distance from the focal plane to the nodal point in the lens. Right, happy with that? No, we're not, are we? The focal plane is the camera sensor, or in a film camera, the camera film. Okay, I'm fine with that half of the equation. Now, the nodal point, it's a point somewhere within the lens. If you had a lens with a single lens element, that would be the nodal point. Now, modern fangled lenses have got more than one element though, and the nodal point is in there somewhere. Now, I've read the words describing it, but I don't understand them. I'm not clever enough, and understanding this is not going to help me. And this is what I call irrelevant detail. So to make sense of this, let me explain in practical terms. A 50mm lens on a full-frame camera gives a field of view similar to that which we see with our own eyes. A lens with a focal length of less than 50mm gives us a wider field of view, and this would be a wide-angle lens. A lens with a focal length greater than 50mm gives us a narrower field of view, and this is called a telephoto lens. Now, when I say greater than, I mean more than, as in 60, 70, 80. And for the less than, 24, 35, blah, 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 blah. I'll come back to this. I need to cover off the other part of this, the other set of numbers, which is the aperture. So what is the aperture in a lens? Well, the aperture is a bladed type device within the lens that changes the size of the lens opening. If you have a lens with a maximum aperture of f4 and you use f4, the aperture is actually invisible. You are not using the aperture. But if you select a smaller aperture than the maximum aperture, such as f8, the aperture thing comes into play and it reduces the size of the lens opening. Now, this reduces the amount of light that gets through to the camera sensor, or film. The number on the lens is the maximum aperture, which, unhelpfully, is the smallest number, but the largest opening. Change to the highest aperture number, and this is called the minimum aperture, which equally unhelpfully is the largest number. Simple, isn't it? It's got something to do with mass and reciprocals and fractions and stuff like that. But these are things I've got no chance of understanding, so I'm not going to try to. And I'm not going to try to explain them to you either, because they're not going to help you. But this will. The larger the aperture, the more light gets through to the sensor. The larger the aperture, the smaller the aperture value, as in f4. The smaller the aperture, the less light gets through to the camera sensor. The smaller the aperture, the larger the aperture value, such as f22. So with my Canon 17-40mm f4L lens, the maximum aperture is f4 and the minimum aperture is f22. So what do these aperture values mean? Well, what does the number f4 actually mean? I've got no idea. No idea at all. But I can tell you this. If you go from f4 to f5.6, that's one stop, as is f5.6 to f8, f8 to f11, f11 to f16, f16 to f22. Each stop is a halving or a doubling of the light, depending on which way you go. And this comes into play when you're getting the correct exposure. And going back to my Canon 17-40mm lens, the aperture range is f4 to f22. But I can't tell you what f4 actually is, as in what it actually means. So much so that if you check out episode 171, you'll find my new aperture scale, which makes just as much sense as the one that we have now. It really does. That's good stuff, that. That was the episode where I modernised photography and sort of decimalised it and made it a lot simpler. It's a great episode, even if I do say so myself. Sorry, getting back to lenses. So the larger the lens's maximum aperture, as in the bigger opening, the smaller the number, the bigger, heavier, bulkier and more expensive a lens is. Lenses with a wider maximum aperture let more light in, but there is a price to pay. So be careful when choosing the right lens. To give you an example, if you bought a 28-70mm f2.8 lens, it would be a lot more expensive, a lot bigger and a lot heavier than a 28-70 f4 lens. And you're getting one extra stop of light. Now, you need to think about the value of that one extra stop compared to the other factors which I've mentioned. So, no, getting back to the numbers, let's not worry what the numbers actually are. What we need to understand is what they do. So the smallest number is the biggest aperture and the largest number is the smallest aperture. I mean, it could have been the other way around, couldn't it? People will say no because of the fraction thing, but shall I move on? Yes, Rick, move on. The highest image quality will be an aperture somewhere in the middle of the aperture range for a lens, and it varies. Each lens has its own sharp bit, and on my Canon 17-40mm lens, it's f8. Right, that was aperture, so I need to quickly explain depth of field, because the depth of field changes with the aperture. Now, depth of field would be better called depth of sharpness because it's the amount of a photo that's sharp from front to back. The larger the aperture, the less depth of field. The smaller the aperture, the more depth of field. The focal length also changes the depth of field. The larger the focal length, the less depth of field. The smaller the focal length, the more depth of field. A larger aperture gives a shallow depth of field. A smaller aperture gives a deeper depth of field. And that's depth of field done. Oh no, sorry, no. Where you focus and where things are in a composition in relation to you and each other, that also affects the depth of field. Now, I think I need to add depth of field to my list of episodes, which I will pretend I'm doing now while recording this, because you know this is a script, don't you? And you know that I've already added it, so I can keep on going. Right, so what are the main types of lenses? Well, you got standard lenses, wide-angle lenses, telephoto lenses, macro lenses, fisheye lenses, and tilt-shift lenses. Standard lenses have a focal length of around 50mm on a full-frame camera. A full-frame camera is a camera with a sensor which is 36mm wide by 24mm high. Why am I telling you this? Because I need to talk about crop factors, don't I? Because it's not that simple, it never is. But sorry, I have to do this. So what's a crop factor? Well, a full-frame camera has a notional crop factor of 1. You don't talk about a crop factor when you're talking about full-frame cameras, but we'll use the number 1 just to help explain the others. So a 50mm focal length on a full-frame camera is a 50mm focal length, and that gives you a horizontal field of view of around 40 degrees. A cropped sensor camera, however, has a crop factor of 1.5 to 1.6. That depends on the camera manufacturer because they all do different things. And that means that a 50mm focal length on a crop sensor camera has an effective focal length of 50 times the crop factor, which is 1.5 or 1.6, or somewhere in the middle, which is about 75 to 80mm. And this gives a horizontal field of view of around 25 degrees. So 50mm on a crop sensor camera is not the same as 50mm on a full-frame camera. To get the 50mm you get on a full-frame camera with a crop sensor camera, you need to divide the focal length by the crop factor. So 50 divided by the crop factor, 1.5 or 1.6, gives you 33 to 31mm. On a crop sensor camera, if you select a focal length of 31 to 33mm, depending on the crop factor, you will be getting the same field of view, the same effective focal length as you do with 50mm on a full-frame camera. Simple, eh? Now, a Micro Four Thirds camera, it's got a crop factor of 2, meaning that a 50mm focal length has an effective focal length of 50 times 2, which is 100mm, with a horizontal field of view of approximately my script says with a horizontal field of view of around 209 degrees. Now, it's going to be 20 degrees-ish, isn't it? I'm not too worried about the decimal points in these numbers. I'm really not. It's not that important. So to get a 50mm focal length, you need to select a 25mm focal length on your lens. And in my script it says, simple, eh? Now, this is important and it's a fundamental point that applies to all camera lenses. So full-frame cameras were fine. The number is the number is the number is the number. It's fine. But with a crop sensor camera and a Micro Four Thirds camera, you have to multiply the focal length, as in the number on the lens, by the crop factor to get to the focal length you're actually getting. Right, so now I've dropped that bombshell, I'll explain the main types of lenses. So let's go back to standard lenses. A 50mm focal length on a full-frame camera gives a 50mm focal length. And this is similar to how we view the world with our own eyes. A 50mm focal length on a crop sensor camera is 75 to 80mm. But to get the same field of view, you need a focal length of 31 to 33mm. And with a Micro Four Thirds camera, 50mm focal length, effective focal length 100mm. Now I'm saying effective focal length because the focal length of the lens isn't changing, it's just the effect that you get, it's the effective focal length. But to get the 50mm field of view with a full-frame camera, you need a 25mm focal length. Right, I think going forwards, I need to explain everything relating to a full-frame camera to keep my sanity and yours. 50mm is a similar view to how we see the world. That's the kind of focal length you use to give a perspective that looks natural and familiar, how we see things day to day. Now, there's no defined divide between wide-angle, standard and full-frame lenses. So a standard lens, it could be, well, anywhere between 40 and 60mm. Some people will say that a focal length of less than 50mm is wide-angle and that more than 50mm is telephoto, but it isn't quite like that, and to be honest, it doesn't matter. So what is a wide-angle lens? Well, a wide-angle lens is a focal length of less than 40mm, as in a smaller number. Popular wide-angle focal lengths are 24mm, 28mm, 35mm. There are others, obviously. So a wide-angle lens gives a wider field of view than a standard lens, which is a relief, isn't it? And the smaller the focal length, as in the number, the wider the field of view. And the smaller the focal length, the smaller things look. They look further away. And the more depth of field you can get. Not get, can get. So what's a telephoto lens? Telephoto lenses have got focal lengths of more than 60mm-ish, or more than 50mm if you're really pedantic, or above 51mm if you're even more pedantic than that. I'm not. Telephoto lenses give a narrower field of view than a standard lens. The larger the number, the narrower the field of view, and the larger the focal length, as in the number, the closer things are or feel to be, and the less depth of field you get. Right, macro lens. Macro lenses are used to get close to things such as, flowers, insects, anything very small. You can get super close, but there is the challenge of depth of field and getting the bit of the photo that you want sharp. It's harder to do. But with a macro lens, you can get those amazing close-up photos of all sorts of things. I don't do that. I bought a macro lens once, played around with it about half a dozen times, and then put it in my bag and didn't bother again. Not for me. And what's a fisheye lens? Well, a fisheye lens is named after the eye of a fish. They're super wide-angle lenses, and they give you an impressive 180-degree field of view. Easy for you to say, Rick. Other fields of view are available, but 180 degrees is a standard focal length for a fisheye lens. Now, you get loads of distortion, but these lenses, they can be used to great effect. I used to have a fisheye zoom lens, which I absolutely loved, even though I didn't really need it. Now, let's just dwell on that for a second. This isn't in the script. If you're taking a photo with a fisheye lens with a 180-degree field of view, if you're stood holding your camera normally, guess what happens? Your feet are in the photo. I know, it's bonkers, isn't it? Right, moving on. Tilt-shift lenses. Tilt-shift lenses are specialist lenses used to give very specific depth of field and correct things like the converging lines on buildings, the super clever lenses, but the manual focus, which was a challenge to me when I had one with my dodgy, aging old eyes, or mince pies, as I said in the script. So that was the main types of lenses, and that's the main types. There are others, but that's 90 to 95% of them covered there. And then there's something that I nearly forgot, which when I was writing the bit about tilt-shift lenses, it reminded me it's autofocus. Now, I expect that every lens that you buy these days is autofocus, apart from some cheaper lenses and specific ones like tilt-shift. But you can turn this off and focus manually if you want to. Now, the last time I focused manually was probably about 1978. I mean, why would you ever turn off autofocus? And I know someone's going to point out some very specific situation where you need to do this, but in general terms, use autofocus. I do. Why would you not use the most amazing technology to get the sharpest focus you can? I have no idea. Right, some other terms. Prime lenses versus zoom lenses. A prime lens has a fixed focal length. An example of this is a 50mm f1.8 lens. Prime lenses are smaller, lighter, and indeed cheaper than zoom lenses. A zoom lens has a range of focal lengths. Now I've got a Canon 24 to 105mm lens, which goes from wide angle 24mm through standard 50mm, all the way to mild telephoto 105mm. This is a very versatile general purpose lens. It's excellent for day-to-day stuff. It's a brilliant lens. Now you can of course get wide angle zoom lenses and telephoto zoom lenses and other lenses that give you massive ranges such as 28 to 200. But generally the bigger the range, the larger the zoom lens gets. And also the larger the maximum aperture, the larger and heavier and more expensive a lens gets. And this is how you end up with these really expensive lenses costing thousands and thousands of pounds. Not that I use any of them. No, I don't. These lenses offer much more flexibility than prime lenses. Variable focal lenses are very popular these days. I haven't got any fixed focal length lenses anymore. I used to have them back in the day, but I don't anymore. There was a time when the image quality was much better on prime lenses than zoom lenses, but I think the gap's closed so much that it's not really that much of a factor anymore. Although I'm sure somebody will correct me and say you do get better quality with a prime lens than you do with a zoom lens. Can we tell though? Well, that's a question, isn't it? Okay, kit lens is explained quickly. Kit lens is an odd term. Kit lens means the cheaper lenses that you get with cheaper entry-level cameras. And a great example of this is an 18 to 55mm lens, which you get on beginner cameras. These are cheaper lenses with lower quality than other, more expensive lenses. If you like, these are beginner lenses. But you could also get kits with more expensive lenses. When I bought my Canon 5D, that came with a 24 to 105mm lens. It was called a kit lens, but it isn't a kit lens. Kit lens means the 18 to 55mm type of lens, the cheaper ones. That's what it means. And again, somebody can correct me and say, no, I got a 12 to 784 kit lens with my Sony XYZ 2000. I'm not that fussed, really. Right, lens mounts. A lens fits onto a camera body using a lens mount. Each camera system has its own specific mount. So you can't put a Canon lens on a Nikon camera, or Nikon, depending on where you are. And neither can you put a Nikon or Nikon lens on a Canon camera. But Micro Four Thirds cameras all have the same mount, so you can put a Panasonic lens on an Olympus camera and vice versa. So there you go. Right, who makes these lenses then? Who makes lenses for cameras? Well, camera manufacturers make their own lenses that go on their cameras and no one else's, and you understand that, don't you? But there are third-party lens manufacturers who make lenses that fit on more than one type of camera. And the quality of these third-party lenses is, in many cases, as good as, if not better than those made by the camera manufacturers. You've just got to choose a reputable brand. In some cases, the better and the cheaper, so they're worth considering. But be careful, if you go too cheap, you get what you pay for. Lens quality. Well, in general terms, the more money you pay, the higher the quality of the lens. That's in general terms. And the higher the quality of the lens, the higher the image quality. A massive generalization, but it's a good rule of thumb. Fortunately, lenses last a long time. My main lenses I've had for over 10 years now. And they still work as well today as they did when I bought them. So get the best lenses that you need, that you can reasonably afford, and they will pay you back year on year. Now, a word on errors. Every camera lens has optical errors within it. Every lens without exception. There's things like chromatic aberration, one that I can't remember, and things like softening at the edges at maximum aperture. Now, you need to check this out and see what defects your lens has got, because that'll tell you which settings you need to use for what you're taking photos of. But remember, every lens has these. It's just a fact of optics. Not one to worry about. They're not massive errors. It's just you need to be aware, okay? Like I say, on my 17 to 40mm lens, f8 is the sharpest aperture with the least errors, and that's the one that I use. But f4, it's got softening around the edges, but for the photos I'm taking, being brutally honest, you wouldn't know, because when I'm taking a photograph of a building, do I care about softening around the edges? Not really. And it's not massively visible softening, so be aware of this, but don't be worried about it, okay? Right, lenses and reselling. Now, lenses last you a long time, and if you buy a lens and you want to sell it in a few years, you might be pleasantly surprised by what you get for it. Camera bodies depreciate much more quickly than lenses, which it makes sense if you think about it, doesn't it? Camera bodies have got that ever-evolving tech in them, haven't they? And camera lenses are optics. Sure, it's clever stuff and technology advances it, but not as much as the stuff in cameras. So they hold the value for longer, and you can use them for longer. Right, one last term, fast lenses. I hate this term. Yes, I've written in my script. This is a stupid photography term. A fast lens is a lens with a large maximum aperture, but it's not fast. Move on, Rick. Okay, the talky bit. This is a bit more talky bit, isn't it? How do we ever end up with these numbers? Crop factors, focal lengths, effective focal lengths. It doesn't help us, does it? So, I mentioned this before, I've come up with an answer to all this nonsense, and you can find all of that good stuff in episode 171, titled The Future of Photography, Making Sense of It in 2024. Yes, I have re-engineered photography so it makes sense in 2024. Not got anywhere with it yet, so I need to come back to that and convince the camera world that I'm right and they're wrong. So in this episode, I've described the main types of lenses, and I did want to explain how to use them and also how to look after them, but do you know what? I haven't got time, so I'm going to do that in the next episode. I used to have loads of lenses. I've had all the lenses I've discussed in this episode, and I don't need all of them anymore. So what you, dear listener, need to do, you need to determine which lenses are the best for you. This will be very specific to you, what you do, and of course, what you like. Right then, what if I use my phone to take photos and not a camera? Well, my iPhone 15 Pro has got 3 lenses. They are a 13mm lens, also described as 0.5 times, 24mm lens 1 times, and a 77mm lens 3 times. Now, the focal length cannot possibly relate to the distance from the focal plane to the nodal point. It's physically impossible. My phone is nowhere near 77mm deep. So there's something else going on here, isn't there? But I do like the way that Apple has used the 1 times, 0.5 times. I like that. And if you go back to episode 171, that is how I describe the focal lengths. And I start with 50mm would become 1 times because that's how we see things. And you go 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, and 0 point going the other way. And it makes perfect sense, much more sense than the numbers we've got, which all goes out the window when you look at a phone. You can get lenses to put on phones, but I've never done it, and I possibly should have covered it here, but I haven't, so I'll probably pick that one up in another episode. So the only thing I'm going to say here is that my iPhone's got 3 lenses, and they're brilliant. But a word of warning with digital zooming, because if you use digital zooming, it's incredibly powerful, but you can get some rubbish. I just missed part of the script there. It was a bit about lens quality. I'm just going to scroll back. Under lens quality, you can take a rubbish photo with the best lens in the world. Having the best lens in the world does not guarantee you great photos. Right, glad I got that one out of the way. What do? I use zoom lenses. With my Canon system, I've got a Canon 17 to 40mm f4L lens, which I use for my photos of buildings. And I normally use the 17mm end of the focal length, which gives me a horizontal field of view of a whopping 93 degrees, which is amazing for interiors and exteriors. I've also got a Canon 24 to 105mm lens, which I mentioned before, and a 70 to 200mm lens. All these lenses have got a maximum aperture of f4, and that's all I need. I take my photos of buildings with my camera on a tripod, and the building's not moving. Well, you'd hope not. So I'm not worried about camera shake or using a faster shutter speed. No, I'm fine with f4. I use ISO 100 and slower shutter speeds, whatever the camera chooses, but it works for me. And as I alluded to before, first use of the word alluded, I used to have loads more lenses, but they've all gone. These days, I just stick to what I need. And with my Olympus system, I've got a 12 to 42mm pancake lens, which is my default lens. So small, it makes the camera almost pocket-sized. And I love this lens too, I really do. I've also got an Olympus 12 to 40mm lens, with an effective focal length of 24 to 80mm, of course, and an Olympus 40 to 150mm lens. I generally use f8 as this gives the best quality and depth of field that I need, and that's with both camera systems. And I've got a favourite lens for each camera system, which helps me to take the photos that I take. And that's it. A new lens for me is a rare event. I bought a new lens recently. It was a new pancake lens because I broke my last one, and that's it. Right, that's what I do. So let's move on to some thoughts from the last episode. Think before you take every photo. Is what you're taking a photo of interesting? Will someone else find your photo interesting? If the answer to either question is no, don't take the photo. Sorted. Move on, Rick. Next episode. Yeah, I mentioned this before. I'm going to have to do another episode on how to use lenses to help you to take the best photos that you can. Having explained camera lenses, I want to talk about using them and looking after them. So that's what I'm going to do in the next episode. I might also talk about how to choose lenses. So this might end up being 3 episodes. I think I've just changed the title of the next episode by chucking that third bit in there. Now, the next episode will also be about lenses, just which bit I'm not sure yet. I need to work that one out. Oh, come on, Rick, get on with this. Ask me a question. If you got a question you'd like me to answer, email me, sales@rickmcavoyphotography.co.uk, or visit the podcast website, photographyexplainedpodcast.com/start, or text me from the podcast feed like Karen did. And if you just want to say hi, say hi. It's lovely to hear from you, dear listeners. Right, I'm done. Finally. Blimey, that went on a bit, didn't it? This episode was brought to you by a space in my script because I didn't know what I was going to eat, but now I do know. It was a cheese and pickle sandwich with some water, but no crisps, which I consumed before I settled down in my homemade acoustically cushioned recording emporium. I've been Rick McAvoy. Thanks again very much for listening to my small but perfectly formed podcast, it says here, and for giving me, and for giving me 27-ish minutes of your valuable time. Now, after I've edited out the mistakes and the other bad stuff, I think this episode's going to be about 30 minutes long. Blimey. Yeah, no chance of shoehorning anything else lens-related in, was there? Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thanks again for listening. I really appreciate you. Take care. Stay safe. Cheers from me, Rick. Don't forget, for August only, get 25% of my splendid How to Become a Real Estate Photographer course. Head over to rickmcavoyphotography.com/courses, click on the course link and enter podcast August to get that whopping 25% off.